Friedrich Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, Essay 2. In the second essay, Nietzsche asks two fundamental questions that are often tied to moral acts and moral motivations, which is the issue of conscience, right? We have a conscience of doing right or doing wrong, and guilt, which is the feeling of having done bad. So these questions will make up the core of this discussion here. Nietzsche starts with looking at the nature of punishment. And he noticed that in history there's two aspects of this. First, we see that punishments have an enduring aspect, and these are the types of customs or rituals or acts through which punishment is expressed. For example, a social organization where people go outside to watch a hanging. This kind of has a ritualistic aspect. He says this is much older and has deeper roots in history. And then there's a fluid aspect, which is, he interprets as the meaning and purpose for punishing. And he says the articulation of this and thinking about why we're punishing is a much more recent phenomenon. And why is this? Because historically, he notes, punishment was often done for various and quite distinct purposes. I would like you to review that list that Nietzsche gives in Essay 2 and section 13 there, to see the various reasons why persons might punish. Okay? So, modern times, we've developed a very specific notion of why we're punishing. And so this fluid aspect takes on a very specific purpose. And usually, or at least originally, it was the idea that we're trying to awaken the guilt within the criminal. In other words, we want the criminal to see that what they've done is wrong. They need to go to jail and think about what they've done. And so the idea is we're awaking the sting of conscience. But Nietzsche points out, and indeed this can be seen from other examples in recent times, that hardened criminals tend to feel the least amount of guilt. In other words, they don't really see their action as being something that's wrong, or at least they don't feel a sense of guilt in the actions that they've done. And so the penitentiary system adds to this. It leads to alienation among criminals, and the punishment also leads to a lessening of guilt. So over time, the idea is that, well, the criminals become more hardened as criminals within our penitentiary systems, which ironically have the aim of precisely doing the opposite. Okay, so while Nietzsche then concludes, contrary-wise and historically speaking, judges, and this is an interesting conclusion, did not really see themselves as punishing someone who feels guilty or sees themselves as guilty. And so this leads to a question, well, if punishment doesn't lead to guilt, well then what is the purpose of punishment? I put a note here, if you're interested in this concept, which is has a lot of implications socially and in terms of our society, you should see Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, his Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. It's a great work that deals with the concept of what discipline is and the role of punishment and how this has been applied effectively or very ineffectively within our penitentiary systems. Nietzsche turns to a more detailed analysis of the previous question. He notes in German there's a very interesting relationship in etymological, the roots of the term. We have the notion of a Schuld, which is a guilt, the notion of guilt, and the notion of Schulden, which is that of debts. And so the relationship here is, notice that they have the same etymological roots, that Schuld refers to guilt, Schulden refers to debts. But what is a debt here? It's a little different from the notion of guilt, right? So they have same roots, different meanings, but Nietzsche says these meanings must in turn be traceable to the same roots. And so Nietzsche notes that guilt, in the Schuld sense, is actually rooted in a contractual relationship which leads to Schulden. Because we have the debtor, which here the word again is the Schuldner, and the creditor, and so the debtor owes the creditor, and this leaves a memory of the debt. And what does Nietzsche conclude? The memory of the debt results in the guilt. So the memory of the debt, the Schulden, results in the Schuld, guilt, because I remember, oh, I have to pay my debt. Okay, and of course, if you have debts to pay, you're going to be worried even now. And Nietzsche is saying, well, this is the origin of guilt, but more deeply and originally, punishments were quite corporeal and grievous. So what happened when the debtor couldn't pay? Now, of course, if you can't pay, you have to be penalized in some way. Historically, the punishment was usually corporeal. It could be also in terms of prison, or it could be in terms of beating or flogging or amputation even. So the body is used as a source of repayment. In the best case scenario, and this is stated ironically, the debtor was turned over to the creditor. In other words, the creditor then had the right to punish the debtor. So imagine that if the person that you owe money to is then given the right to punish you the way that they deem fit. And usually this would be done through the infliction of pain, these types of pain upon the actual body of the debtor, according to a specific law or restriction. And so the question is, what does the creditor gain from this, right? Because they're not getting any money back. And this is where Nietzsche ties his notion of this inversion of morality and this notion of the will to power and the fact that we all seek powers, that the creditor, and creditors in this sense, those who give out money and etc., are usually in history deemed as sort of lower class individuals. Aristocrats are never in need of money. Well, sometimes they might be, in which case they have to go to a creditor. So the creditor does not gain the money back, but what do they get? They get the pleasure of inflicting punishment. So they obtain the right to be cruel. And in particular, let's imagine that an aristocrat owes to a creditor and can't pay, and suddenly the aristocrat is given to the hands of this lowly creditor, and the creditor now has the right to punish this great aristocrat. The pleasure then becomes even more gratifying. And why? Well, it equalizes inequalities. In other words, the lowly creditor now has the right to act like a lord and to take the place of the lord and to inflict punishment at their own will and whim. And so in this sense, it brings the creditor up to the standing of the aristocrat and gives them a certain power relationship. Now, I want you to recall here Aristotle's notion of reciprocity as tied to the exchange of goods, and that he notes that this is kind of an original sense of the notion of justice in the previous work in the Nicomachean Ethics. Here Nietzsche is kind of reiterating and echoing those claims. I want you to also note Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. It's about a Jewish creditor and an aristocrat who owes to the creditor, and the debtor who owes to the creditor, and the creditor demands a pound of flesh if the debtor doesn't pay up. It's a great work which kind of shows this notion of ressentiment. It's also there's a certain discrimination and prejudice tied into the work too, which I think you could tie into Nietzsche's works as well. So it's interesting to look at that. There's also a film that you could watch, which was not too long ago done on the topic, so I would recommend it. So what is the origin then of conscience itself? And Nietzsche says it's rooted in the repression of vital instincts. So these are instincts that we seek to express, but for some reason society demands that we repress them, that we don't express them, and so the result is that they're turned inward. Anyone who's familiar with Freud is going to see the links here between Nietzsche's works and Freud's works, and they're kind of originating at similar times, and Freud will at some level be drawing from Nietzsche. So Nietzsche calls this, what the result of this repression of these instincts, bad conscience. Actually, Freud calls it the superego. In other words, I have a desire to take what I want, but I'm not allowed to in society. And in fact, I'm told that you have to stop doing that. And from this, you develop this demanding superego who's constantly yelling at you and telling you that your desires are bad. And Nietzsche calls this bad conscience. And so this, he thinks, is the origin of conscience itself. And he notes hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting. Note that, joy in persecuting, in attacking and change and destruction. All of this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That, he says, is the origin of bad conscience. And by turned against the possessors, he means repressed, turned inward. So this bad conscience is not only something that can affect us personally, but it can actually be expressed on a socialized level. And when this happens, it is expressed in a similar sense of owing a debt. So we feel that our ancestors are the source of our existence, for example, and from this arises concepts of an afterlife or a soul. And this is attached to debt repayment, for example, ancestor reverence, honor, and so on. Also, we look to great persons and leaders who, for example, die, and they're deemed superhuman. And to them, we feel a great sense of debt. And this, Nietzsche notes, evolves into this concept of the gods. And debt to the gods becomes spiritualized, leads to a form of blood sacrifice as repayment, including human sacrifice. And finally, Nietzsche notes that the climax of all this, of this notion of guilt and bad conscience, is worked into the concept of the suffering God, Christianity. Why? Because debt and repayment is demanded in the highest sense, that God himself must be sacrificed for our debts. And notice our debts here. We are debtors, in fact. Our sins are our debts, and repayment must be exacted for these debts. Okay, so what you're not seeing here is that Nietzsche is looking into these historical concepts. And of course, you have to recognize this is Nietzsche's interpretation. And he's interpreting the history, and at some level, you could say it's a very narrow, specified interpretation. But he is drawing out some very interesting points in saying that this debtor relationship is, in part, informs our fundamental notions, not only of justice, but of our basic conscience, right? And the notions of guilt. And then tied to that, right, this notion of conscience, is the idea that we seek to express these vital sources, but we are expected to repress these within society, and this itself is tied to that inversion of morals that he speaks of.